Yesterday, he sounded more serious than ever. And in particular, he combined criticism of Russia and Putin with some suggestions about the things he's going to do about it. And in particular, he mentioned the two most important areas where he can put pressure on Russia. One is by providing more weapons to Ukraine. Specifically on that, he said he's going to allow Europe to pay for American-made weapons, and those American-made weapons will make their way to Ukraine. So new weapons for Ukraine, first-class weapons made in the United States, sophisticated weapon systems like the Patriot missile. Second, he talked about economic measures that he's going to take against Russia if Russia does not enter into a ceasefire and be reasonable about the terms of a ceasefire. He talked specifically about doing secondary tariffs, but he also talked about sanctions. Secondary tariffs is something new that has only been done under the Trump administration. They did it with Venezuela. And what he's talking about with respect to secondary tariffs is if that a country has companies that do business with Russia, he could put tariffs on that country as punishment, and which would coerce that country and that country's companies not to do business with Russia. So what is he really talking about? He's talking about the countries that have companies that are helping Russia sell its oil. And that's how Russia makes a lot of its revenues that it pumps into the Russian war machine to continue the fight in Ukraine. And those countries principally are China and India. They buy a lot of Russian oil. They also have companies that make it possible for Russia to transport its oil. And so when he says secondary tariffs, he means putting tariffs on those countries. He also talked about sanctions. There's also something called secondary sanctions, which would have the same impact, but the mechanism is different. So if he goes forward with either of those things or both of them in combination, that could be the type of effort that is necessary to get Russia to come to the table in good faith, which so far Putin has refused to do.
Okay, I also want to ask you about the hardware here, because Trump is also sending more weapons, including Patriot missiles, to Ukraine, but he is ruling out longer-range weapons that could strike Moscow. So what message does that send to Russia? We'll give you a little bit, but not all of it.
Well, that's been something that has been a policy of the United States that's been continuous from the Biden administration into the Trump administration. And remember, at first, the Biden administration had very strict restrictions on the use of U.S. weapons and wouldn't allow the U.S. weapons to be used at all in a way that they could attack Russia. Slowly, those restrictions were eased by the Biden administration. So President Trump is basically saying, I don't think he's restricting the use of U.S. weapons to attack inside Russia. He just doesn't want the attacks to go as far as Moscow and other big cities in Russia. But again, the United States can ease those restrictions at any point. And apparently there was a recent conversation between President Trump and President Zelensky about whether President Zelensky would be using weapons to attack Moscow. My understanding is President Trump was just asking, do you plan to do that? He wasn't saying you cannot do that.
Interesting. All right. You know, President Trump is also, we've been listening to the tone here. Trump has seemingly become more frustrated with Putin over the past few weeks. I'm sure you've heard it in his voice. We had former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, on earlier. Here's what he said.
President Putin has himself to blame for this. President Putin has overplayed his hand. He has been coy. He has tried to tap the president along to make President Trump think that Putin is really trying to do things to end this war. He's not. And President Trump has figured that out, and he's irritated.
Well, did he do it to himself?
Well, Ambassador Taylor makes some good points. Putin is very coy and he's very clever and he says things that he doesn't always follow up on. And President Trump is basically calling him on that. What President Trump talked about specifically is his frustration that he has conversations with Putin, and he said he talks to him all the time, and he says those conversations go very well. And then, for instance, he said afterwards he talked to the First Lady, Melania, and said, you know, I had a great conversation with Putin. And Melania reminded President Trump, yeah, but Russia just did a whole new wave of attacks on Ukraine. And so Trump is saying that seems out of character with the conversations I'm having. So Trump seems to be coming around to the idea that maybe he can't trust Putin, something a lot of us have known for a long time. And that's kind of what Ambassador Taylor is referring to, that the history of Putin is that he never follows up on promises he made. He broke the Minsk agreement and other agreements he made with Ukraine. He's broke promises he's made to the United States about how he will conduct the war inside Ukraine.
All right. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure. Thank you, David Tafuri. We appreciate